China, it's back on the attack against Canada today over the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive detained in Vancouver last month. I'm sure you remember the story. Well, Meng was arrested at the request of the United States. Now, a spokesperson for the Chinese government is accusing both countries, Canada and the U.S., of abusing their extradition treaty. CBC Asia correspondent Sasha Petrusik has been on this story since it began early in December when the Huawei exec was arrested. And Sasha is standing by live in Beijing. A bit of an audio delay, Sasha, but what is the Chinese government saying right now?
Well, this was one of the daily foreign ministry briefings. It's where we've heard most of the comments against Canada that have been coming out of China for the past weeks. China basically continued to take a very hard line. It denounced the United States for the news that it was going to continue ahead with the extradition request to Canada for Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive. And it also attacked Canada for even considering this extradition request. This is sort of the tone that we heard today, and some of the comment from the spokesperson from the foreign ministry.
任何具有正常判断力的人都可以看出，他从一开始，加方在这个问题上就犯了严重的错误。因为孟晚舟的事件显然不是一起普通的司法的案件，加美呢任意的滥用他们之间的双边引渡条约，对中国公民的安全和合法权益构成了严重的侵犯。我们敦促加方呢立即释放孟晚舟女士，切实保障她的正当合法的权利。我们也强烈敦促美方立即纠正错误，撤销对孟晚舟女士的逮捕令，不向加方提出正式的引渡要求。
So lots to say about Canada, obviously, but China also had some things to say to the United States. This was directed at them. It said that the U.S. should correct its mistakes immediately, revoke the arrest warrant, and basically drop any of these requests. That's kind of interesting because if anything, today's briefing really focused more on the United States than we've heard over the past few weeks. China has been careful to avoid offending the United States. There are trade talks going on, and they've sort of stepped pretty gingerly by attacking Canada and kind of ignoring the United States. Today, they weren't ignoring the United States, so perhaps a slight shift in tone that Canadians could appreciate.
And this all comes after a letter. I mean, there were 140 international China experts, including 2 former Canadian ambassadors, who signed this letter appealing to China to free those 2 Canadians, the 2 Michaels, Kovrig and Spavor. What is China saying about that letter, Sasha?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this letter, it's a very important issue, of course, and it was meant to plead the case for the 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig, the former diplomat, and Michael Spavor, the businessman, who have been held since December, haven't really been heard from except to a few Canadian diplomats. This letter was supposed to plead their case, but China's response was really almost over the top. It was very, very strong and very defensive. One thing that they said is that this letter creates an atmosphere of fear, in that by openly attacking China, what these academics and diplomats are doing is challenging Chinese sovereignty. These are the sorts of things that they had to say, and they also directed their anger toward the people who signed it, saying that they were not being truthful and that their voices could not possibly represent the whole world, and they'd be outweighed by the shouting of 1.4 billion Chinese. Well, all of that sounds like a little bit over the top, but clearly the letter did find a bit of a mark today, and those comments really represent that.
Thanks for that, Sasha. That's CBC News Asia correspondent Sasha Petrusik in Beijing. Now, the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister are trying to build international consensus in support of Canada over the fate of those detained Canadians. CBC's Janice McGregor is on that angle of the story. She joins me live from our nation's capital. Janice, Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland is expected to make this case in front of some of the world's most powerful political and business leaders. I'm talking about Davos. What are you watching for from there?
Yeah, we talk about the World Economic Forum every year at this time. It's a huge gathering in Switzerland of some of the most powerful voices in business, but also diplomacy. Government leaders go there. It's a chance for them to network and talk about kind of the issues du moment, if you will. And Canada has 4 of its ministers there this year, including Chrystia Freeland, as you say. Last week, China's ambassador in Ottawa warned Freeland not to go taking its concerns about China's treatment of these detained Canadians to Davos, trying to sort of rally more support for Canada's side in all of this. How interesting then to see that today in Davos, the chairman of Huawei, his name is Liang Hua, he was in Davos doing a bit of an unprecedented PR push, speaking to reporters there as well as business leaders assembled, trying to persuade the world that Huawei technology actually can be trusted, that it's not a form of espionage for the Chinese government. And in the process, he called for the quick release of Meng Wanzhou, his executive, of course, who was detained in Vancouver last month. And he said that this case is a legal procedure and that Huawei has every confidence in the legal proceedings. And that's very interesting because what we'd heard from the Chinese until now was that they believed that Canada was treating this as something that was politically motivated on the part of the Americans as well as Canada, and that Canada was doing the U.S. bidding in all of this. And of course, Canada's response is no, we're just following the rule of law here. You mentioned that letter of 140 former diplomats and academics, experts on China. Former Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques, one of the signatories of that letter, was speaking to CBC News Network earlier this morning. He talked about how China's been reacting to Canada's efforts on all this.
I think it took the Chinese by surprise because they are used to bullying countries around and until they submit to what they want. In this case, I think this support has been very important. It's important to continue to get it. But I think also we have to get to better communication with China.
So Canada's diplomatic push continues. We've been reporting on it incrementally as Trudeau or Freeland are out sort of calling this person, speaking to that person. We tallied it all up yesterday, something like 19 kind of different people trying to be tapped for support in all of this. And I don't think Canada will be backing away from that diplomatic push anytime soon.
Now, we do know Washington has until January 30th, so that's a week tomorrow, Janice, to make that formal extradition request. What happens then?
Yeah, so Meng's next court appearance in Vancouver is scheduled for February 6th. The extradition process could be very long. It could, frankly, take months to sort this out. A judge will hear the evidence against her and consider whether these charges that the U.S. wants to proceed with are fair. It's very interesting, though, because the deadline that the U.S. has to officially make its request for extradition, January 30th, is coinciding with some very interesting talks in Washington when senior Chinese officials will be there to discuss the next round of attempts to de-escalate the U.S.-China trade war. And it's getting more and more difficult to separate these two things. The U.S. has launched a federal investigation into Huawei technology, accusing it of being ripped off from the technology of U.S. companies. Of course, intellectual property really is at the heart of the U.S.-China trade war. And the U.S. has refused to use any Huawei technology in its next generation wireless networks, so-called 5G networks, because it has fears of espionage, exactly the thing that the chairman was trying to alleviate fears about in Davos today. So we are in a situation where all of this could be heading for a climax sometime in the middle of next week.
We'll talk again. Thank you, Janice. CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa. CBC News confirms the U.S. is planning to extradite Meng Wanzhou. Canada's ambassador to the U.S., David McNaughton, tells CBC News Washington is indicating the extradition of that Huawei executive will go ahead. You know that Meng is now free on bail. She was arrested in Vancouver in December at the request of the U.S. She is accused of violating U.S. sanctions against trade with Iran. Swift reaction from China. At a news conference in Beijing this morning, China's foreign ministry said Meng's arrest was, quote, a mistake from the start. Beijing again calls on both Canada and the U.S. to drop her case, adding China will respond to whatever action the U.S. takes. Well, it is our top story, and we've reached out to former Canadian ambassador to China, David Mulroney. He's right here in studio. I don't think I'd make a very good diplomat, because I'd say, let's just sit down and figure this out and, you know, till the end of this conversation. But this back and forth, what do you make of this latest back and forth with the U.S. saying we're going to begin that extradition process?
So essentially, two tracks are now converging. For Canada, it's been the detentions and the death sentence for Robert Schellenberg, one of our citizens. For the U.S., it's been trade talks with China. And you have a very senior Chinese leader who's going to Washington next week to see if they can do a deal. All of a sudden, and what China desperately hoped was that the Huawei issue would just go away. Canada would do something. It isn't. It doesn't appear to be going away. And what China wants to avoid at all costs is to have its leading technology company exposed to all the trouble and travails of a trial in the United States. And that's just what appears to be happening. So more damage potentially for Huawei, this Chinese tech giant.
When you say Canadians would like this to just go away, anecdotally, and people that I've been speaking with, Canadians that I have spoken with say, you know, we just want it out of our sphere because it is muddying the waters. But we are bound to the U.S. on this and to China because we have to answer in some cases to them. This is a Chinese citizen. Where does that leave us?
So I think the Chinese would like it to go away, and Canada, you know, just wishes it hadn't happened in the first place.
But don't you think Canadians say, just let's get her out? We don't want her on our soil anymore because that's the problem.
I think so, but once you dig deeper, extradition and sanctions are part of an international legal system that a country like Canada really depends on. And I think, you know, what we've seen to date is that we've handled it very, very fairly. Madam Meng's had her bail hearing. She's out on bail. She's got a good legal team. She'll have, if this does indeed proceed to extradition, she'll have many opportunities for judicial review. So we're doing what we should be doing. I think the ambassador to the U.S., McNaughton, expressed some of our frustration to say, we're doing the right things. Now, U.S., it's time for you to step up. And that's what appears to be happening.
The Chinese accuse Canada and the U.S. of abusing this extradition system. But is there any abuse here?
There doesn't appear to be any abuse of the system. At the heart of this, and what a trial in the U.S. would, I guess, bring to light, is the very serious allegation that Huawei and Madam Meng herself attempted to defraud a financial institution to cover their business dealings in Iran. So that's something that is potentially a violation of Canadian law, as well as, and this is what the extradition decision will hang on. If this had happened in Canada, is it something that would proceed to trial? So it's a serious issue. And because Canada is such a crossroads for the world, we need extradition treaties to work, and we need the international legal system to work. And this is what this is all about.
We're also in an election year. So for the government, they want things to run, of course, as smoothly as possible. Trade talks with China, perhaps those will go. Perhaps we'll hear more about that in the campaign. How does this muddy things in this election year?
It muddies things because I think the Chinese have very cruelly but very accurately detected our weakness. And our weakness is really something that's commendable. We care for people, and we care for our people. Canadians now live their lives and pursue their careers all over the world, including in China. And what China is saying is, if you give us problems, we know how to make you hurt. We're going to detain your citizens. We're going to, give them much harsher sentences. We're going to mistreat them if necessary. So this is not going to go away as an issue, but it's really important that we stand up to the Chinese. Otherwise, we open ourselves to this as, that this is the key to getting a good decision out of Canada, to detain another Canadian.
But when you say stand up to the Chinese, how far can we go in doing that without putting a wrecking ball to perhaps those other issues like trade and diplomacy?
Well, one of the things that I think is happening is we're beginning to look at the relationship with China in a new way. And the Chinese would love us to think that as long as we just look the other way and ignore these things that it's doing, we can move on, closer to this, broad sunlit upland of a wonderful relationship with China that's always around the corner but never quite there. Let's look at the relationship seriously and see that it's not all that good all the time. And it's important for us to stand up to our values. And if China can't deal with us as we are and with our values, then maybe we have to look at the relationship, not our values.
All right. We'll certainly be watching this story. I know you'll be keeping an eye on it. David, I want to thank you for coming into studio and sharing your insight.
Thank you, Sahana.
Former Canadian ambassador to China, David Mulroney.